Hi, Tizzy.
Hi, Will.
This is our last interview, and it's actually a bonus conversation that's going to take a little bit different form than our previous discussions. So, Tizzy and I are going to spend a little bit of time setting up this conversation, and I'll just start with this. We have learned so much from each interview individually, and I think I've listened to all of them at least 3 times, and I take something new from every new listen. And so individually we've learned a lot, but additionally there's some really powerful themes and lessons from the interviews collectively. And we just have to start here and say we are so grateful for the time, knowledge, expertise, experience, and advice of those who chatted with Tizzy and I throughout the process. These conversations were so informative and so fun. But it is important to note that there are so many more coalitions and leaders who are doing really meaningful work who we didn't get to talk to. All that is to say that there's a lot left to learn in this space.
Will, you're so right. And I too want to echo my gratitude and appreciation. This has been an amazing journey that we've been on these last couple of months. So for this final interview, we are so pleased to spend some time with Justin Scarr. He's a true expert in drowning prevention partnership and collaboration, as well as being a leader in drowning prevention efforts in Australia and globally. And for this conversation, we realized that instead of focusing exclusively on the Australian experience, we wanted to look more broadly at some of the takeaways we heard from all of the interviews and reflect on these topics with Justin as a thought leader in this space. We also want you to know Justin is our friend and colleague as well. And we've worked with him and we've had fun with him. And we just felt like this brought even more meaning to the conversation to be able to spend time together. All right, well, as we prep for this conversation with Justin, what else do we need to know?
Okay, so some logistical context. Tizzy and Justin and I had several discussions before our conversation on how to frame this and what we wanted to accomplish. In that process, Justin actually listened to every interview that we have done. So he's stepping into this having already listened to all the interviews.
And from there, he provided us with a really thoughtful written reflection. And we based our conversation around a few major themes. And those include framing the issue from multiple perspectives, multiple stakeholders, leadership, and coalition architecture and strategy. And while we focus more on these broader themes that we heard in the other interviews, Justin also brings in his perspective and a few examples from the Australian experience.
So in the interview, you're going to hear a couple things. Justin does briefly mention the UN resolution on global drowning prevention, which the United Nations General Assembly passed just a few months ago. There has been years of advocacy around elevating drowning prevention on a global stage. And I'd highly recommend that you look a little bit more into that process and how the UN resolution has opened new doors for those working in drowning prevention. One other term that you're going to hear Justin use is ministry. So when Justin uses the term ministry, he's referring to a government department. So he might say something like the Ministry of Health. For us in the States, just replace that word with department. So health department, transportation ministry, transportation department. The ministry is just a government department.
And there's one other term, NGO. That stands for a non-governmental organization and basically refers to any organization that's not part of government. That could be a nonprofit, a community-based organization, or a foundation as examples. And so now it is my great pleasure to shift us into our reflection conversation with Justin Scarr.
Justin, Tizzy and I are so happy to spend some time with you today. reflecting on lessons learned from the interviews with state water safety coalition leaders. We are so grateful for you and your work and your leadership in global water safety, and for the time that you spent listening to the interviews and your willingness to chat with us today. I'm really looking forward to digging into some of your insights and reflections from those interviews, and more broadly, your thoughts and perspectives on drowning prevention partnerships and collaboration. So for those listening, Justin Scarr is the Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Life Saving Society Australia. He is the chair of the Australian Water Safety Council and has been the convener of multiple world conferences on drowning prevention. Justin is a leading advocate and an expert in the development of drowning prevention partnerships at local, national, and global scales, and has served in a variety of roles advising global drowning prevention initiatives with the World Health Organization, the Bloomberg Foundation, and other international non-governmental groups. On top of all of this, Justin is working on a PhD at the George Institute of Global Health in Sydney, and his project is focused on drowning prevention partnership. So Justin, I'm hoping we can start off by having you describe quickly how you got into water safety and kind of what your entry path was.
Look, thanks for the introduction, Will. It makes me sound like my life is all about water safety and drowning prevention, but absolutely no fun at a dinner party, right? But look, it's really great to join the podcast. I've really been enjoying all of the interviews that you've been doing. But my drowning prevention story is it's not really all that impressive. I was a school teacher once upon a time. I took off traveling around the globe. When I was traveling, I went to some wonderful places, including Vietnam. And then when I came back to reality and needed to find another job, I decided I wasn't going to be a school teacher. The Royal Life Saving Society Australia had a friend. I had a friend working there, and they had been approached by the Australian government to help with a lifeguard program in Vietnam, in Da Nang, Vietnam, in fact. And so, the people there hadn't left the country, and they needed someone who had some context to Vietnam. And so I met with them a few times just to give them a little bit of background on the country and all of its wonderful elements in those stages. And they offered me a job, and here I am probably 25 years later. I've had some really wonderful experiences, both domestically and also internationally. The project that I thought I'd be working on back in 1998 was cancelled, and it took me another 12 years to get back to Vietnam, where we hosted the World Conference on Drowning Prevention in Vietnam. And I have a real energy for the global perspective. That was certainly a real eye-opener, was being introduced to the work in Bangladesh from Dr. Amina Rahman at the Centre for Injury Prevention in about 2003 and 4. And for me, that was a real game changer. Before that, I thought I was very much a water safety guy. I'm very passionate about swimming and water safety. I think the Bangladesh experience gave me a sense of the magnitude of drowning, but also a public health approach, working with the Alliance for Safe Children over those years in building that program, and sort of opened up my eyes to the possibility for working with a range of stakeholders and sectors to solve problems that we're all collectively very passionate about.
Well, thank you for that. And thanks for your work in this space over the past couple decades now. Something that I've heard you say before that I'd like you to kind of describe a little bit is I've heard you advocate in other spaces that we need a platform for drowning prevention. So I'm wondering if you would describe what is a platform for drowning prevention and why do we need one?
Yeah, I guess my version of a platform is it's more of a stage than a table. I heard many of your coalitions talk about this notion of a table and bringing people, other stakeholders, sectors to a table to debate and talk. I think my version of a platform is a little bit broader than just a table to discuss plans. I think a platform includes, clarity of vision and mission. It includes some sense of strategy, and I see strategy different to planning. I think lots of coalitions have plans, but they sort of lack a little bit of clarity around the strategy. And then there's got to be room enough on this platform for all of the groups that are currently playing in the water safety drowning prevention world but all of those not yet currently engaged or playing. And in many respects, those sectors are far more important than the ones that are currently engaged in the issues. So, so when we talk about a global platform to reduce drowning, it was a solid foundation. It was a stage that provided opportunities for everyone. We had clarity of vision and strategy and purpose. And there's a table there somewhere, and that table had, it's a metaphor for the governance of this platform. We've used, in many cases, we've talked about a global partnership. You interviewed Steve Beam, and he's certainly collectively, very passionate about this idea globally to create an architecture where all groups, irrespective of their, the common thread is here, we all want to reduce drowning. We all want to prevent drowning, but we bring a very different collection of experiences, a very different collection of sciences, a very different collection of ideologies in many respects. And we need to create forums where we can all get together and work and harness our energy and strengths. And there's got to be a good balance between the passions of the NGO sector, their ability to mobilize, people in the field, lifeguards, swimming instructors, with the interests of the academic sector. And then, of course, none of this will work without government buying in. And leaning in, for that matter, not just buying in, but leaning in. It's not just their money we want; it's their transformative power in terms of policy and making things happen at a system level that's really valuable and important. I really sort of drew a lot of energy from your coalition interviews because a lot of my time is spent pondering this at a global level. But I think you give some really good examples of the sort of transformation that can happen when water safety planning and coordination is localized. So many of your coalition examples really had some power, were really strongly nested down at that local community. And they were doing the sorts of things we've been talking about globally, but doing it in the context of their local communities and then building up. So that grassroots approach, I found that came out really strongly in a couple of the example podcasts.
And gosh, that just really speaks to thinking about what the role is of a state coalition or network versus a local level. I wondered if we can stay on this platform concept for a little bit longer and talk about the actual stakeholders involved. And you used a term when we were getting ready for our discussion today, positionality. And I realized I wasn't even sure what you meant by that. And was it around formal and informal positions, or who may be coming in, who is an executive director versus the lifeguard who's there at the beach responding? And so it made me think of all kinds of things around those stakeholders who are involved. And I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, look, I think I made the word up. I'm not sure. I should Google it. But I guess what I was trying to explain is that all of your podcasts were really, the first thing I got from them was an understanding that the position of the individual talking, and I don't mean their role or title or that they were the president of the Water Safety Coalition, but essentially where they stood and where they looked at the problem and the solution. That position was very, very different. And so you had Ralph Gatto with tremendous mana, and he was adaptive in a sense that he wanted his service to adopt sort of a proactive preventional approach. So and then you had like Tony, I think it was, at a real public health perspective. So Ralph, as an example, is standing there watching water safety. He's initially looking at it from a lifeguard perspective. Tony is looking at it from a very public health perspective, and then you had some other examples where they were looking at it from a swimming and water safety perspective. So everyone sort of has a different position or take on the problem, and it also impacts on their perspective on what the solutions might be. And I think this is the water safety challenge, or the drowning prevention challenge, is we've got to recognize that our bag of tricks, and we all come to these conversations with a bag of tricks, and Will's tricks traditionally might have been lifeguard service and all of the tools of rescue, and then with his public health background and experience now, he's got a bag of tricks that are around data and analysis And you Tizzy, you've got a bag of tricks as well. But so the positionality sense was just when coalitions are formed, those initial initiating vehicles, the people that involve their leadership bring a perspective on the problem, and also probably are able to heavily influence the sorts of solutions that are the first solutions that are chosen. So the framing of the problem is incredibly important, and we should recognize that we all bring a different perspective on the problem. We kind of all come from very different perspectives and bring a different take on water safety. And I guess the key to whether it's a platform, whether it's a coalition, whether it's something formal like a partnership, is to design some architecture that I think focuses on, the individuals and populations we're most trying to influence. We all recognize we've got a bag of tricks, but collectively what's important is, our strategy and our cohesion and our leadership and what sort of impact we have at a community level.
I've always thought 1 + 1 is more than 2.
Yeah.
And you bring people together, and it's definitely more than 2.
Your comments are so salient, I think, for so many groups in the States right now who are either looking at forming local partnerships or statewide groups. And again, thinking for the US National Water Safety Action Plan being released next year, what advice or guidance would you offer these groups as they come together from all of these different perspectives? And for people listening, and we'll just call this out, right? I am a ocean lifeguard and a public health data nerd. Like, what advice would you offer to people like me, or people in the swimming safety sector, or people coming at this from sport or recreation or government? How can we best stand on the platform together, acknowledging and bringing our own bag of tricks, but also be ready to learn from others and advance a collective multi-sectoral agenda?
Look, I think that the last bit is key here. If it's a multi-sectoral agenda, you've kind of got to recognize that what coming into that conversation is really important, but the links you're able to make and how quickly you can make links to others in that coalition or in that room or in that discussion, how quickly you can build bridges to their interests and experiences, the resources they bring. Potentially, the more effective you're going to be collectively at identifying the what, the how of what needs to be done and what might make a difference. So, I think the people that are having a real impact in these coalitional contexts, whether it's nationally or at local level, are the people that are able to build bridges between sectors. I think we misuse the word sector quite often, but the bridges might be between the lifeguards and the public health group. So the Hawaiian example is a really good example of those two expertise. The expertise of the ocean lifeguards matched with a public health expertise. They're both speaking very different languages, but in your podcast in Hawaii, it was very difficult to tell the two apart. I mean, Ralph was talking the language of public health, and you could hear sort of a warmth and a shared commitment. So, I really think the people that are making a difference in these conversations are those that are able to meet in the middle of the room. They're not the ones that are sitting in the corners just talking to their lifeguard friends or their swimming instructor friends or their academic friends or their public health friends. But those people in a room or in a conversation or in a system that are able to build bridges between the two. And so I think, if you think about the great people, in all of our communities, they're the ones that are able to talk two languages and bring groups together. I think they're the ones that are having a huge amount of impact. I mean, you interviewed Dr. Steve Bimman. He's a bridge. He's a bridge between his tremendous sort of life-saving lifeguard pedigree and his medical expertise and public health. David Walker is a bridge. He's a bridge between the injury prevention science. So most of his day job is not water safety. It involves road traffic and child safety, and he's bridging to water safety and finding links across the traditional water safety sector across the UK to create some great energy. And Tizzy, you've been a wonderful bridge. Linda Kwan is a bridge. If you think about Dr. Kwan, you know, she's got that tremendous grounding in public health, and you know, she's certainly led the way in terms of recognizing that, you know, water safety is not about Speedo wearing swimmers. It's actually about the people who don't wear Speedos and can't yet swim, come from cultural backgrounds that are, you know, don't have the water prowess that so many of us in the conversation, you know, hold dear to our heart. Yeah.
That bridge building aspect is so key to leadership. And we clearly heard about leadership and leadership structures in these interviews, and where each of the people that we spoke to saw themselves in that role, and also in thinking about the way the leadership aspect of these coalitions, whether it was a committee or a person or all of those pieces that create leadership. And Justin, can you talk about what reflections you have from listening to these interviews and from your own, all the work that you've done and your own experiences?
Yeah, look, there were some really great examples of leadership. Like there were some really strong individuals and I'm struggling for names, whether it was Arizona or perhaps Florida, but just this idea that there were already these community coalitions, lots of little leaders at a community level, probably with you know, with great passion and interests and, you know, probably ego, I don't know, but and that somehow this coalition had been successful in bringing those groups together, lots of little leadership cells. So, you know, I think sometimes, you know, people have you know, a false assumption that, you know, the leadership is up and you look at the top of the triangle and there's the leader, but actually the, you know, community leadership is probably, you know, an organizational leadership is, you know, I mean, leaders within organizations that are prepared to accept their organization will not have all the answers. 1 + 1 is they'll be stronger by forming links with others. That sort of humility and leadership, I think, is really important when we're talking about water safety, because, you know, let's be frank, like individually, as organizations, we have strong passion that we, you know, and a great strong conviction that we know the answer and we know the solution, and we've been, you know, organizations like YMCA and you know, Surf Life Saving in Australia, Royal Life Saving in Australia, the Swim Teachers Association, we have strong conviction that we know the problem and we know the answers. But the sorts of leadership I think is important in coalition building is those leaders that recognise perhaps they don't have all of the answers nor all of the solutions. But what's more important is that the group comes up with a shared understanding of the problem and some suggestions on a solution. I did think, I mean, one of the great challenges of leadership, of course, is knowing when to step back and step away. And I do think it was probably Arizona where the Texas maybe, where the initiation of that coalition was described as I think it was Texas, but if it wasn't, it was one of the others, a wonderful woman, you know, from a swim teacher background that had initiated a coalition, but got to a certain point, recognized that she needed to step back in order for it to grow and prosper. And, you know, I think there are a couple of examples where the coalition was nested within a particular organization that didn't have the organizational energy and resources, or there'd been a leadership change, and therefore the coalition secretariat needed to move and adapt to somewhere else. So, you know, I think when I think of leadership, you can't look past the individuals that are critical to making these things happen. You've got to look at the sort of the small L leadership that's constantly working to make it successful, to bind groups together. And then, of course, we've got to be confident enough to step away and watch these things grow, because in some respects, leadership can be stifling to a coalition, and recognizing when it's stifling. You know, I think that's sort of key to navigating the sort of adaptive requirements. Particularly, everyone talked about COVID impacts and Zoom, and someone said the F word, funding. Everyone was worried about where do you get money and how do you make this happen. So these coalitions, we're not talking about Bill Gates here and that, you know, his form of global partnerships. We're talking about low resource, everyone leaning in with their volunteer effort and energy. And so I think it's really important that we have a shared sense of leadership rather than this sort of top-down approach.
So to that end, I'm wondering if you can share with us some reflections on architecture and structure of how these groups operate? Because
Yeah.
in the interviews, we saw 8 different examples of how these partnerships happen. In your experience, in Australia and globally, you've probably seen 100 different ways that these groups are organized. Earlier in one of your answers, you commented on how important architecture was to facilitate some of that multi-sectoral collaboration. I'm very curious for your thoughts on architecture, structure, governance.
Yeah, like if you listen to all of the podcasts, if we listen to presentations at World Conference on Drowning Prevention, everyone is trying to influence government at some level. Whether it's the water safety people, they want some funding for lessons to be compulsory, whether it's the public health types, you're talking about system change. And so we're all sort of influencing government, but coalitions can often initiate and be successful just as an NGO vehicle that's actually has significant distance from government. Government might sit in some contexts at some tables. But my sense is the ones that are generating traction at the moment, particularly with the UN resolution that puts a little bit of pressure on governments, hopefully, to get organised. They're the ones in the middle that are successful in getting government not just to the table, but to validate that there needs to be a table, there needs a strategy, there needs a plan. And when they're at the table, they're bringing some energy and some resources and some confirmation that the issue is important and needs to be addressed. So, I do think that there were some really good examples of NGOs working together, very much focused on local mobilization, lots of events, lots of education. And then you've got some examples that were very much focused on the table being about the system and influencing the system, changing policy, measuring impacts at a system level. And actually it's interesting because the US is probably a little bit similar to Australia and the UK for that matter, Canada, where the NGOs have enough capacity to get on and create energy and opportunity. And in some respects, we can do most of this without government. But if we ultimately want to impact at a system level, we've got to draw government into the table. The other thing on architecture that I'm really watching closely. One of the instincts of a small group sitting around the table to say, how do we make this happen? One of the right things is to say, well, it's got to be inclusive and we've got to invite anyone who wants to be involved. And I think sometimes the room's too big. It takes a lot of energy to coordinate partnerships, coalitions, a lot of energy. And so sometimes I fear that we fill the room with too many groups and you spend too much energy coordinating the groups and not enough energy on getting things done. So most of these coalitions influence a lot but control very little. It's logical that you've got to navigate some key players to the table or to the platform. But I just fear sometimes that we overwhelm by being too consultative. And so separating decision making from consultation, I think, is important. One of the failures in the Australian water safety strategy, if I can talk about failures, is we control very little. It's very much it's a document, a framework of influence, and in that consultation process, each cycle, we determine that we're going to be more focused. We're really going to drill down on the things that will make a difference, and we initiate our process. We send an invitation far and wide. We get lots of views and interests and research into the process. And then at the end of it, we have a lot of trouble sorting back down into those 3 or 4 priorities, and we end up with 15. And so we go inclusive. We include everyone's views. We do a little bit of filtering of those views. We develop a plan, but it's largely too broad. And so I do think it's interesting in an architecture level of where's the sweet spot between having the right people in the right room at the right time, but also signaling to the broader sector that what you're initiating is something that's ultimately going to empower, collect, and harness their energies as well.
Wow, there's a lot there, and you really pulled forward some of the big challenges around how big, how small, how broad, how narrow. You also used the term plan, and you talked about plan early on, and wondered about your thoughts related to plan versus strategy versus vision, and to continue to keep weaving in, how do you figure out who needs to be closely at the table without leaving anybody out where they feel like, wait, why am I going to help because you didn't want me at the table? Just again, I think that if we keep kind of pulling that thread as well around how you make from plan and strategy and vision happen, where you actually make something happen and have the right people there to do it.
Yeah, like I mean, I think one of your podcasts, it might have been the Great Lakes. Most water safety groups, when they get together and they say, let's have a vision, it ends up being a world free from drowning, a California free from drowning, zero drowning. I think everyone agrees that we're all trying to reduce and eliminate drowning. So the vision part, I think, is very common across the globe. It's sort of the I guess the tactics that come next that matter most, and asking yourself whether the coalition is about control or influence, tactics or mobilization, and I think that's kind of that's a discussion about the resources and the capacity of the initiative, right? So the Australian Water Safety Strategy started as a plan, and it had lots of columns with this person will do this, and this organisation will do that, and this this thing will be achieved within 2 years. And at the end of the review of that, it was pretty difficult to track, because actually the power to implement those plans, those activities, was not the Water Safety Council or the Water Safety Strategy. Many of those activities were nested in the plans of others. And so the next set of tactics in 2008, we shifted from plan to strategy, putting forward an architecture of all of the key areas where activity, action, influence, change needs to happen. And so the Australian Water Safety Strategy now has 15 areas where we think that change needs to occur. We describe that change. We signal the sorts of indicators and actions that will add value to the overarching strategy, but it doesn't delegate those tasks to anyone. And that's twofold, right? Once you start delegating, you create some responsibility, you start to get into the argy-bargy of who does what and how. And the Water Safety Council has no resources. So we've deliberately chosen an approach which is to create a framework. This sort of says, this is what needs to happen. And then in other places, we work out how that happens and who does it. So in the case of the Australian Water Safety Strategy, what it's trying to do is influence the plans of others. Tizzy, if I can make that a little bit more tangible. So it's not a plan itself, but it's kind of signals some important areas, some science, some activities, some prioritization. But the ultimate measure of that strategy will be whether or not Royal Lifesaving embeds those activities into its plans, or whether the state government of Victoria actually develops a strategy and a plan and aligns that to the framework that's signaled by the strategy. And I suspect that it probably can, it really depends on what sort of resources you've got and whether you have that mobilizing capacity. Then if you have that, have a plan. If you don't have that and you're actually trying to influence others, then I would skew towards the strategy side. Build a framework that says this needs to happen. Let's focus on what needs to happen, not necessarily how it happens, and move your plan downstream a little bit, because the ultimate sort of measure of success, I mean, drowning happens at a community level. So the action needs to be, in many cases, at a community level. And so, our strategy's got to need to mobilize people and activate them, motivate them locally, where we're not trying to influence government or policy level, of course.
This perspective is interesting because we have heard a lot about plans, and those working in water safety in the US are going to be hearing a lot more about plans in the coming 6, 8, 10, 12 months. the framing that you've provided of a strategy, and the purpose of that strategy being to influence other groups and people's plans, is, I think, a different perspective than what we've heard. So it is helpful. Thank you.
I like too that feeling of ownership, back to how you engage and how everyone is part of the solution. This strategy around how it fits within others' plans, that's really helps to build ownership and accountability and engagement and multiple places versus it centralizing out of this one place. And then it's like, hey, I have my own goals and objectives within my organization. I only have so much time for this versus it being a part of your work as well.
Yeah, I think that's really important, particularly in a multi-stakeholder model where you've got sort of NGOs and government and counties and the like. I think there are so many layers in the planning process all the way through those organizations that the best you can hope for really is to influence others. And so, so make that tangible though. If we've got an Australian water safety strategy, our vision is that the local swim school can align its commitments and activities to the Australian water safety strategy, or the local council. They can adopt this sort of perspective on reducing drowning, and for us, our drowning rates are tragic, but they're incredibly low by world standards, right? And so we're pivoting to the promotion of a love of water, and that's that definitional issue between drowning prevention or water safety. Some of the groups like the Great Lakes were talking about tourism and the tourism sector not wanting to talk about drowning initially because it might discourage people from coming to the Great Lakes, but actually realizing the potential. Hawaii was talking about this as well in terms of sector. So we're pivoting to promote getting people wet and enjoying the water, enjoying those recreational activities, but just providing some risk measures that may well keep people more safely. I think the other thing that's challenging, so the community mobilization and the influence of local actions, I think that's a great space for all of us to play in. The other area is upstream and just working out if the ultimate objective here is to influence government. What we're seeing in Australia, what we're seeing globally is that there is no one ministry for drowning prevention or water safety for that matter. And so this is a real problem, whether you're working globally, nationally, provincially, locally, probably. And maybe it's clearer locally, I don't know yet, but it's like, where does it sit within government? And remembering that government is sectoral as well, like each arm of government has a different codification, a different language, a different speak, a different set of priorities, a different minister that has their own sort of values and perspectives. So uncoding, unpacking that language of drowning prevention and linking it into a ministry. So, if you run around the globe, there's a big push with World Health Organization to make this a public health issue. But actually, when you look at who's driving drowning prevention outcomes at a national level and those governments that are mobilizing, Thailand is very much public health. It's linked to their public health strategy. In Vietnam, it's a ministerial panel that's led from the perspective of social development and welfare. If you listen to Olive Kubasini in Uganda, it's transport and it's agriculture that are coming together. So I think we've kind of got to work out, when your coalitions sit and ponder and look up at government architecture and work out how do you get them, those people over there, to do the sorts of things we want them to do. I think it's tremendously challenging to work out which door to knock on and what language to use. And I think that's important in the coalition, is that if you've got a diverse stakeholder group, it might be that you've got a good into injury prevention because you've got the public health types at the table. It's important to have the lifeguards. Maybe I think the Hawaii example was usually they interface with the fire brigade, but the transformation there was because they were all of a sudden nested in the EMS, which gave them a more direct route to data and the like. So, I do think that influencing down, influencing up in a sense is just as important.
So this is bringing our conversation, I think, full circle, because at the very beginning, we talked about a platform for drowning prevention. And one of the things, two things you said, one, there needs to be enough room on the platform for everybody that's currently working. There also needs to be enough room for those who aren't working in this space yet. And the other thing that you said was, building bridges. And you gave some great examples of building bridges between kind of what we think as the traditional water safety spaces. But there's also this whole element of building bridges to those sectors or those parts of government that don't even know that they're aligned with water safety yet. And we heard several great examples in the interviews of people discussing, speaking the language of climate change, or speaking the language of disaster risk reduction, or health promotion, or sport development. Right? There's so many avenues and ways to approach this. So as people are thinking about partnership and this whole idea of multi-sectoral partnership together, is there anything else you want to add, or any further guidance that you would offer to somebody listening to this, potentially leading, potentially participating, potentially thinking about participating in a group of people moving forward for drowning prevention, water safety, that doesn't necessarily look only like them? What advice or final thoughts would you offer?
I think be realistic. I think this is easier in a high-income recreational setting than it is in leading agendas in places with much higher drowning rates, but no system capacity for it. So I think it's less of a problem in Australia, or probably in the US, in terms of casting a broad vision about all of the possible groups that could come to the table. My inclination is these things will still be built around those who feel a day-to-day passion for reducing drowning. And it's just that they then need to bridge to those groups that they think can spend a good deal of their time, effort, and energy to make that mission or vision or the plan come to fruition. Change is kind of best done in small doses, unless you've kind of got some sort of transformative event and activity that is a great catalyst for significant leapfrogs. But in a water safety sense, the change is likely to be incremental. And so focusing on those small steps and those groups that are where there's a plausibility that they could believe, be involved, make a difference, start there. Rather than filling the room with everyone. Like, I think we drown ourselves in consultation if you cast too broad a net in the first instance. So, talk about tactics. Start small, establish a core, make sure that your core fully understands that the objective here is not building an empire, it's not building a new organization, but it's actually to grow the core. But I think one of the underlying final sort of thing, it's all different. They're all different. They're all energetic. They're all passionate. They're full of committed people doing wonderful things. There is no expert in the room in any case. Like, there's no one way to do this. It's multi-sectoral. It's all going to be different. It's more art than science. And beware of the person that stands in the room calling themselves an expert, because this is art. This is sort of navigation, really. There's no one way to do this. I think all power to you if you've got the energy to pull groups together, to motivate them and stimulate them with podcasts like the ones you've been doing, to give them the right data at the right time, and get it moving and see what emerges.
Thank you so much, Justin. This has been an incredibly rich conversation. And just like with all of our interviews, we feel like we could just be continuing this conversation for the rest of the day and onward from there. Like you said, we're all learning, and every little piece that we take away is another opportunity to grow and to learn from each other and keep getting better in this work.
All right, Justin. Well, thanks so much again for your time. We're grateful for you and for your reflections on this project and your really salient remarks on how we can do partnership well together.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Tizzy.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks, Will.